Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar. We've got a couple quick housekeeping items. We have a lot of participants today, as you well expect, and so we've got everybody muted, and because of that, we just ask you if you have questions, you can put them in this questions or dialogue box here, and you can post them at any time. When we finish up, we'll try to make some time to answer as many questions as we can. I have a feeling there may be a lot of questions, and so if we can't get to all of the questions, then we'll take that information, or you can email us directly or give us a call, and we'll go through that information. So what I want to do over the next 20 to 30 minutes was really look at understanding what is this new Pennsylvania volunteer background check law, what does it require, but I also want to talk just a little bit briefly about maybe being a little bit more proactive and some success that we've had here in Indiana and some other places with legislation like this. So we'll probably talk a little bit about long term is making your voice heard and looking at how other areas of the country have been able to turn the tide on some of these really kind of over-the-top, very restrictive type background screening policies. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then how we can help you with, in the short term with what this new law requires. So we are also recording this, so if you have any colleagues that couldn't make it, we'll make this available on our website as well, so that you'll be able to access, this information, or if you need to listen to it again. So let me get this GoToMeeting going. My background, I'm Mike McCarty. I'm the CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions. I'm also founder of Safe Visitor and Auto Ref Check. We are a background screening firm located in a suburb of Indianapolis. We have about 3,500 clients across the United States, probably close to 2,000 churches and ministries that we work with. My background was in violence prevention training consulting, done a lot of work for Department of Justice, Department of Defense, Homeland Security. So I've got a lot of experience both on the practical side of law enforcement and criminal records and understanding those sides of the issues. And then we've been in business as a background screening firm for about 10 years. We started in 2004. How do these type of laws get enacted? And I can say right now, this is without a doubt probably the most restrictive law on volunteers that I've ever seen. I've talked to some of my colleagues at the National Association of Professional Background Screeners, of which we're a member, and really have never seen anything so wide mandating as this that is passed in Pennsylvania. I'm sure that doesn't bring you any kind of solace, but in a lot of locations you might have certain volunteer groups that may be granted access to like the FBI checks, but most of the time they make those optional, so they still give them options to work with, but we've never really seen an entire state mandated for all their volunteers to have to go through so many different hoops of a background screening process. Background-wise, I would say, this is what I typically call the CSI impact. I testified yesterday here in Indiana in our legislature on a bill for schools and background checks, and it's really this CSI, it's the TV, it's the belief system that if I get somebody's fingerprint, I can tell anything and everything about them, and it's certainly not true. When you get fingerprinted for a background check, it doesn't pop up and say, hey, that's Mike McCarty, and oh no, Mike doesn't have any criminal records. It really doesn't have a clue who I am when you fingerprint me unless they've entered a criminal record and they've tied it to my fingerprint. And so these databases are really only as good as the information they receive, and I'll allude to a couple studies here in a minute that are fairly recent that show that these databases are very problematic. So what has happened is a lot of legislatures rely pretty heavily on state police as their advisors. And by doing this, kind of the comfort zone, if I'm law enforcement, and I just, kind of shared that I'm former law enforcement, that if your comfort level is in this fingerprint type system, and that's really all you're familiar with or all you really know. And so a lot of times, depending on what state you reside in, policymakers may or may not be at all aware of what private companies can do and what private companies are doing in terms of background screening. And so law enforcement officers not necessarily experts on criminal records. When I say that, I'm not trying to be malicious. I was a violent crime detective. My wife spent 20 years as a police officer. My father retired from the Indiana State Police. My grandfather was in policing, cousins in policing, and I have a brother that's still a detective. So I've got a long history of law enforcement in my family. But what happens is, there's a belief system within that community of these fingerprint-based checks, but that they're not kind of the end-all gold standard that we originally thought they might be. And so because of this kind of lack of education, that's where, you guys can be effective here kind of over the long term, is just kind of making your voices heard, become active. Most organizations, most people, you kind of passively sit back and legislations pass and you agree or disagree. And I was in that boat for a long time, and I wasn't very active. But about 2 or 3 years ago, we've become very active in the legislative process, both locally and then through the National Association on a federal level. And so it's just it's a matter of utilizing those representatives that represent you and making them aware of what's available, what's happening in other places, what options exist, and kind of unifying or banding together so that the more outcry that they hear, the more likely that, they may look at, coming up with a viable, alternative solution here. We've talked to probably, I don't know, maybe 100 churches in Pennsylvania alone, and we know that there are hundreds and hundreds more volunteer organizations in your state that's being impacted by these laws, and so we know it's very invasive for volunteers. It's going to require a lot. There's things we're going to be able to do for most of your volunteers that may streamline that process a little bit, but it's still going to require some work on the part of your volunteer. And so, how is that going to impact you? Obviously, these background checks are very costly. The cost of these background checks are easily, double and sometimes more than triple what we would normally charge in most states. And those are primarily all fees going to government, state, and the federal government. So certainly going to be huge budget issues for you guys. But I think it also can really impact your volunteer base, because we have groups in other parts of the country where the volunteer may shoulder part of this cost, and by doing that, then, when you're already struggling to find volunteers to work in the nursery or with your children, then you really may find, the volunteer base starting to dwindle. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of this background, and I've got, copies of this information that I have up on the screen right now that I'm more than happy to share. These are great starting points for, just talking, if it's a letter or an email to your representative, and just referencing some of this information is a great place to start to try to mobilize and really look at coming up with a viable solution down the road, where you're not in this position of having to spend this much money or time, because we've looked at kind of the turnaround times on some of these required checks, and where we normally can do a background check in 3 or 4 business days, you may be looking at 2 to 3 weeks on some of these, and that's completely out of our purview. I mean, that is the state that actually controls that, and so just as kind of some background, on this type of legislation, there's been this long belief system that this FBI background check is kind of the gold standard. But, to really put this in perspective, first I have to understand that the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, which is the FBI background check, was not created to do employment or volunteer background checks. It was created as an investigative tool for law enforcement, and it relies heavily on local law enforcement agencies to send their data to them. I've sat in on committee hearings in legislatures where, members of different committees talk about, how slow some communities are to report, how some are not reporting information. You have to have an NCIC terminal to send information in. And so because of those issues, that's where these two recent studies have really looked at, how good is this FBI data? And the first study, National Law Project, came out 2 years ago now, and they estimate that about 600,000 people are, incorrectly labeled with criminal records each year in the United States, so that's terribly alarming. I mean, it just really kind of sheds some light on the quality of the data. And then another study that came out in 2006 estimated that the FBI database was missing more than half the dispositions. And so it didn't know if a person was arrested or if they were convicted. If they were convicted of a felony, was it a felony or was it a misdemeanor? And so there's just a lot of problems within that particular database, but that would be indicative of all databases. And so that's kind of what has driven a lot of this legislation is nobody kind of stepping up and having an active conversation about where are the limitations, and we've been doing that for a long time. I did it yesterday. I'll be in the legislature again next week on another bill, and we had this same conversation yesterday with legislators. We talked about what private companies can do, how they do it, how do you mandate a best practice so that a private company is adhering to higher standards. And this bill that we testified on yesterday is actually for school employees. And so the state of Indiana is saying that, we'll allow you to do an FBI check, or we'll allow a private company to do the background check for all school employees and volunteers. And it passed out of the Education Committee 12-0 yesterday. But it defines exactly how a private company must conduct these checks. And so part of what would have to be reversed here would really require some, education and some reaching out to some of your policymakers so that they better understand that there are viable options that are much faster, every bit as comprehensive or more comprehensive, that have a lot of consumer protection, because you're not going to get any consumer protection out of a government agency. The data is going to be the data. It's going to spit it out, and it's either going to be accurate or inaccurate, but there's not going to be any means for your employees or volunteers to really dispute that information. A private company, we're required under federal law, if somebody disputes information, we have to reinvestigate that information. So a lot of this is just because I think a lot of policymakers are not aware. And I was quite surprised that maybe some background screening firms in Pennsylvania didn't step up and make their voice heard a little bit more in this process. So all that background kind of leads us to where we're at. No matter what we think, so these opinions that we're holding, the information that we know about why the law may have been passed doesn't do us a whole lot of good, because right now you've got to comply. And until this law could potentially be amended, you're going to have to deal with the law as it's written today. And so what does the law require? And so it's a bit confusing even, as a law, in that it puts in this kind of parameter of a 10-year parameter. So it says, we're going to make sure every volunteer that's, working with children has to have a Pennsylvania State Police background check. So it has to go through the Pennsylvania State Police. And you're also going to have the Pennsylvania Child Abuse Clearance or background check. So everybody has to have that. Then, if you have a volunteer that has lived outside of Pennsylvania in the past 10 years, so anybody that hasn't consistently lived in Pennsylvania for the last 10 years, you're going to have to add another layer on top of that, which is the FBI background check. And that one cannot be done by a private company. There's no way for us to do it. The FBI basically uses what they call channelers, and they have a certain number of channelers, and then the states all basically contract with a channeler. Most states just, pick a single channeler that they contract with, and that's what they've been, most states have had this in place for a long time for firearms registration and things like that. And so that channeler can collect your fingerprints, but they are only channeling your fingerprints then to the FBI, and that's what they do. So they wouldn't let me or our company or any other background screening firm do that for you. You're going to have to do that on your own. They have select places where that has to be done. You have to register online, which I'll share here in just a minute. And so that part of the process, for those that have lived in Pennsylvania less than 10 years, that added step is going to have to be self-initiated on their part. We can do the Pennsylvania State Police, and we can do the child abuse check. And kind of how this works, and I'll be honest with you, let me put a little asterisk right here, because we've been talking to the state since before Christmas. Wasn't a lot of answers then. The answers even now are a bit sporadic, and it depends who you talk to each day on some of the answers we're getting. But basically how this process would work, you set up an account, you collect the authorization form. We're a single source where you enter that information on the candidate, and once you enter that information and an email address for your volunteer, we basically take care of everything from that point. Because what happens then, we can take the information, we can run the Pennsylvania State Police background check, then we have to generate an email to your volunteer, and we have to send them a link and a unique prepaid code for the child abuse background check. And because they have to be unique, it can't be automated, so each code we've prepaid for. So we give them the code, and then they have to log in to the child abuse background check site, enter their information. They have to answer a few questions, and then we can receive that report and access all this information and back into our system. We've had a few questions today, or shall I say maybe over the last week, about us running the child abuse registry check. I personally just logged in and went through the system myself. I understand that some people have said that third parties are doing this for them. I don't know how it could legally be done. We're going to reach out and ask some more questions, but right now the child abuse registry check requires that you answer, I think, 2 or 3 questions, and then you have to e-sign that as the volunteer that you are basically saying that information, you're attesting to that information is accurate and correct. And so I don't see how any third party can sign that, authorization legally. So the process is a bit clunky. I think we can take a whole lot of the clunkiness out of it to make it a little smoother on your end. But then if the volunteer falls into that category of requiring an FBI check, then they're going to have to go with this link that's on the website here. And I'll upload both the recorded webinar and these particular slides that I have here up on our website, so you'll be able to access them. But you basically go to, it's Cogent ID, that's the channeler, I'm assuming, for the whole state, and the volunteer would have to log in, or basically go on their website and pay for the fingerprint portion of the background check, and then it would list options where they would go and actually have their fingerprints taken to complete that FBI background check. So that piece has to work outside of all of this process because there's no way for a third party to be able to do that. So what we've done is a couple things. Not only have we created these packages that would comply with what the law is mandating in Pennsylvania, we also have added both a Social Security verification which is really critical because, if it's asking you, to complete these checks, and the Pennsylvania State Police and the Child Abuse Registry check are name-based checks, and so it needs to know if your volunteers have been known by any other names. And so if somebody were to have had something under another name, they could leave that off an application. And so this particular search would allow us to double check the information that you've entered on the report just to make sure that person has given you all the names. And then if we see a name that wasn't listed, we'll add that to the reports that we submit to the state. It would also give us address history, and so there's a chance that if we saw where somebody really has only just recently moved to Pennsylvania, then we could let you know that even though you may not have ordered that, but in fact the public records show that they've not lived there for 10 years and they may need to go get an FBI check. We also added the National Criminal Database, and so this is a multi-state database search, because what's required of most of your volunteers, if they've lived more than 10 years in Pennsylvania, is only a statewide search, so they could have committed crimes in other parts of the country. And so we just added that as another layer here of protection. We'll create some guides for the child abuse check because it's clunky for the volunteers, so that as you're having them fill out that authorization, you could just photocopy kind of a guide that they could walk away with, so when they get the email, they kind of understand what those steps are and how to go through that process to get their child abuse registry check initiated. And then we'll continue to have some dialogue with the state agencies, looking at, how to streamline this process, if at all possible, to make it easier on you guys. But right now, I think it's typical of some types of legislation like this that are passed, and things are happening very quick on their end as well, and they're a bit inundated, and so getting a lot of kind of conflicting information from time to time. So hopefully over the next week or so, we'll be able to really look at if there are any options for streamlining it further. One consideration, we've got a Pennsylvania School Board Association memo that came out in December, and I put this up here as something you might want to look into. So what it really says is effective on December 31st, 2014, all new volunteers must have clearance in order to be approved for their positions. But effective July 1st, 2015, existing volunteers who do not already have clearances, and those volunteers with clearances that are going to expire or have already expired, must obtain the required clearances. So not giving legal advice here, but to understand what this is saying, it sure seems like if you've got existing volunteers, that it's kind of giving you a little bit of time here to get these clearances completed on your current volunteers. But any new volunteer as of 12/31/2014 would have to go through this new process. So it may be a way to let you stagger some of these out a little bit, so you don't have to run large volumes of these, in the next couple weeks to get everybody certified. But I put that up there only as a consideration that you might want to consult your counsel and ask a couple questions. But this is the information that went out to Pennsylvania schools concerning this law for volunteers. So covered a lot of information there kind of quickly. I'm going to pause for a second, open up this questions box, and see if we can answer some of the questions that I know you guys have. Okay, we have quite a few. At what age do volunteers need to register? I don't think I saw anything specifically in the law. So I'm not even going to venture a guess here. I would say generally these type of laws are looking at adults, but it doesn't make that clear. How will this work for people who do not own a computer? Well, the one part of this that requires the volunteer to actually receive a code, they would have to be able to log into an account with the state to initiate this. So if they didn't have a computer and don't have email, you're going to have, maybe, a computer terminal that might be available there at the church where the information could be sent back to an account there at the church where they could do it there. Can we use checks that other organizations submitted? Example, is a school volunteer background check information valid for church use? I mean, I'm only going to read between the lines here. A lot of these are very legal questions. My assumption would be because what is required now as of 12/31/2014 applies to all volunteers. So if you have completed this process for one organization, my assumption is that that information would be good for another organization. That's just going to open up arenas where that sharing of information is going to become important and critical for you as a church. If somebody says they have this clearance through another volunteer organization, what kind of documentation do you have? Is it a letter from that organization that certifies that that's been completed? I mean, I think you'd probably want something more than just word of mouth. So logistically, you're going to have to kind of work through that process. But I don't know why you would have to complete this for every organization you're going to volunteer for, that's sharing of the information, because this is good for a 3-year period, so this will be required every 3 years. You're just going to have to come up with a policy of what you're going to require so that you can feel certain that they've had this clearance through another organization. All right, I think this question really kind of falls along those same category. Daughter is a teacher at a preschool in Pennsylvania. She's already been through all of this. Again, yeah, just as long as, if you got some certification that you can show that documents that they have gone through this process, then I think you'd be fine. Yes, I think, this question about can volunteers use a church computer, it might be a very viable way of doing this, especially for some that maybe don't spend much time online. It might really help help them through that process. So I think having a PC available at the church would probably be very beneficial. Yeah, great question. Is this applicable for employees in addition to volunteers? Same question I had today as we were preparing for the webinar. Everything in the statute that we've looked at is referencing volunteers, so I can't answer that question. I don't know at this moment whether it does or not. Another question about teens and juveniles. I don't know if the statute distinguished an age or not. We have groups of volunteers who serve at our summer camps because they are separate organization, typically a church. Will we need to complete the background checks? That's going to be more of a policy issue with the camp. I mean, the camp, if you're sending volunteers to the camp itself will be responsible for ensuring that everybody that is volunteering has had these background checks. So, that's going to be more of a partnership issue, but certainly I think most of these camps are going to coordinate with the churches that they partner with so that they're not duplicating these very expensive background checks. Okay, somebody had mentioned that it's adults only according to the paperwork that he has received. How much is the package that you mentioned? We've got core package is $35, and if you email me, I can send that information back to you so you can have a hard copy of that. Can volunteers outside of Pennsylvania get their FBI check done in their home state? Good question, because how this works is the FBI and the U.S. Attorney General is the one that grants access to organizations to the FBI database, and then the states have to pass laws that would allow certain organizations to run an FBI background check. And so I'm not sure if they are outside of the state, if they could actually do that through their home state. And quite honestly, those fees vary a lot. I believe the FBI part of the check in Pennsylvania is $27.50, so it's right around $28. In Indiana, just as a comparison, the FBI check in Indiana is $42, so it's not the same in every state, and so it's whatever the state sets that fee at. So I don't know if they could do that in another state. My guess would be it would probably have to be done, or should be done, in Pennsylvania for you to be able to receive the information. College students that are Pennsylvania residents attending school outside of this state, because they don't give us a lot of information on how the FBI side of this works, and because we're not allowed to be part of that, but typically how that works is when they register, then they go get fingerprinted, but that report has to be channeled back to an organization that has authorization to get that. And so you being the church that's now been authorized in Pennsylvania, that information has to come back to you. So if they initiate this in another state, there would be no legal way of getting that information back to you. So I think this would all have to be done within Pennsylvania, would be my guess. Could we organize a single day with you to get all the volunteers together to complete the volunteer questions in a group setting? The problem with like the questions with the child abuse registry site is each one of them are going to have to log into that specific site, answer the questions individually, and sign them. You could certainly, if you had a volunteer training day or had them all at the church at one time, that might be very good, because then you could walk them all through it and help everybody kind of get those concluded at one time. We've got a couple staff members here. I'm going to throw out a couple names. One would be Bridget in our office, that is kind of becoming the de facto Pennsylvania expert. So as you have questions about this process, just call our toll-free number 888-215-8296. If you ask for Bridget, she can answer a lot of these questions, and we're going to develop some sheets to help you guys as well. So somebody, let's see, I believe I hear you saying we should contact our state legislators to see about getting this law amended to be more reasonable. Would absolutely be happy to put together some talking points. We have talking points on this particular topic, so it would be very simple for us to do that. And so if you would email me or Bridget individually, and my information is up here, so it'd probably be easier just to email me for now. What I'll do is prepare those talking points a little more specifically to what is happening here, and I'll probably get our national association involved as well, because I know there's background screening firms in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if maybe a lot of them are not working in the volunteer realm or what, but they would be the perfect, group of professionals that, would, want to engage on this particular topic. If a Pennsylvania worker changes school districts, do they have to be recertified? These are very legal and technical questions. I don't think I can answer that. My common sense assumption would be no. If they've been certified and you can ascertain that they've been certified, that should be good for a 3-year period. And I think that 3-year period answered the next question. Will our services notify you upon a 3-year, or will we have to set a calendar reminder for 3 years? No, we actually have the ability in our system to create an interval. So we could put an interval in there of 3 years, and then a month before that 3-year anniversary, it would send you a PDF report of all the background checks that are going to expire. And you would just simply check the ones that are still volunteering, and then it uploads back into our system. We can run a recheck. We also have a safe visitor system, which I kind of alluded to. It's another program that I helped develop, and with the Safe Visitor program, it's really a visitor volunteer management program, and so it would do the same thing. Would be able to manage that so that you didn't have to keep some kind of calendar alert to keep up with this. What is the name of the bill that was passed? Can we obtain a copy of it? I don't have the bill number in front of me, but I can get it. Again, I may add it to the slides here, so when you download the slides, you'll have it. Everything I've read has referred to it as the Jerry Sandusky statute, which is kind of interesting in that he didn't have a criminal record, so a law such as this would not have prevented anything that happened there because he didn't have a criminal record. Somebody confirmed it is age 18 and up. Does Safe Hiring run the Pennsylvania State Police check or just the National Record check? No, it is the Pennsylvania State Police check, the patch. We go directly through the Pennsylvania State Police. It's the search you're required to do. According to the Cogent ID website, somebody posted which Pennsylvania uses for the fingerprints. Someone outside the state would need to have fingerprint cards done by local law enforcement and mailed to Cogent. So Cogent's going to have to be your channeler if they're not in the state, but they will be volunteering in the state. It's got to go through them, which makes sense because they have to channel the information back to you as the Pennsylvania authorized organization. And we have a bunch more questions. If they haven't been answered, we're going to wrap up here in about 2 minutes. So any question that does not get answered, please email me so that I make sure we answer these questions. There's a lot of them in here still. I'm not a current customer of yours. Do you have a yearly fee? No, there's no additional fees. You basically, it's a per candidate fee. And somebody posted that you do have to be recertified because the second school district needs to know if there was a problem at the first district. I worked for a PA school district for 9 years. A lot of these are very technical legal questions that we wouldn't be able to answer. What is the penalty if you don't get the background checks? Not sure that the code actually gives what the penalty might be. House Bill 435. Somebody posted is the actual bill. All right. I think we have gotten through most of the questions. If you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to send me an email or give us a call. And somebody just added real quickly here, Act 153 of 2014 from House Bill 435 is the actual bill site. So I hope this has been beneficial. I know this stuff is confusing. I know it's overwhelming. I really can't even imagine, to be honest with you. I mean, again, working with thousands and thousands of clients, I mean, I really feel for you guys because never seen anything quite like this. And you know, I'm very active in policy, and this has just really been one of the most surprising laws I've seen. So we're trying to do everything we can to make the process as simple and easy for you as we possibly can. But I would go back to what I started out with is, A, you got to figure out how to comply. B, you know, make sure that your voices are heard. And, you know, we've had conversations at the national level with the National Association about helping with a grassroots effort in Pennsylvania to kind of help. But I think if enough volunteer organizations make your voices heard to your particular representatives, that'll go a long way to maybe opening up some debate on this, you know, in the future. So again, thanks for taking some time out. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call or email us. Have a great afternoon.